This PowerPoint deals more with moving from assessment to actually developing interventions. So it picks up where we left off with the functional behavioral assessment information. And it covers what you do once you have done a functional behavior assessment. One of the biggest problems or issues that I see sometimes in schools is the fact that people will do functional behavior assessments. They'll gather the data, collect the information, and then they don't really do anything with it. So the big question is, once you've got the information, what do you do with it? How do you use it to develop a more effective intervention plan for your student? We'll also discuss some different things that should be considered when you're developing a behavior support plan for a student. An important point to remember is when we're developing a behavior support plan, we're really talking about our behavior. The only real way that you have of changing the behavior of your students is through your behavior, and this is a basic point that a lot of people don't understand. Sometimes when I'm talking with people in schools about a behavior intervention plan, and I start talking about, okay, these are things that we need to do, and then sometimes I've actually had a teacher tell me, look, the kid's the one with the behavior problem. I know what I'm supposed to be doing. Well, you may very well know what you're supposed to be doing, but the only way we can affect a change in the behavior of students is to change our behavior. So behavior plans are really about changing antecedents and consequences, and also changing our behavior so that we're teaching a student alternative behaviors. So they really teach us things to do differently. What can we do different from what we were doing before so that we can affect a change in the behavior of our student? Effective plans are built on assessment results. This is something that wasn't true in the past. We discussed in class how in the past behavior plans were built based on what the behavior looked like. One of the starting points for developing an intervention plan is to come up with a summary statement. Remember, a summary statement is a hypothesis. It's a theory about why the behavior is occurring, and we develop it based on the information that we have. We also use the competing behavior model as a way of examining what's currently happening and determining what to teach. An effective behavior support plan also makes the problem behavior irrelevant or unimportant. This happens by changing the environment so that the problem behavior doesn't work as well as it used to. It does that by making the problem behavior less efficient. When we talk about behaviors, efficiency is the amount of effort that has to go into behavior before it results in reinforcement. So we want to make problem behaviors not pay off as well as they have been in the past. We also want to make them ineffective. This means that we want to make them just not work quite as well. So when we talk about making problem behaviors irrelevant, ineffective, and inefficient, we do that by identifying the reinforcer and trying to reduce that. It's often impossible to eliminate all reinforcement for problem behavior, but we can make it much less reinforcing. Also, we want to teach new behaviors that are going to work better. In other words, the new behaviors are going to be more efficient than the problem behaviors. Whenever you develop an intervention plan, you have to consider the setting in which it's going to be implemented. That's why it really doesn't work if someone completely from the outside comes in and develops a plan and then gives it to people and says, hey, this is what you need to do. You can get some good ideas from people on the outside, but it requires people who are actually going to be implementing the intervention to have some investment and some ownership of it. So the intervention that's going to be used has to be consistent with the values of the people who are going to be implementing the plan. In other words, If you have a school that's very committed to full inclusion or including kids with disabilities in general ed settings, you may implement interventions a little differently than you would a more self-contained kind of program. Doesn't mean that you can't do effective interventions in each, but in an inclusive setting, you're certainly not going to want to do anything that's going to make the student with disabilities stand out more in the eyes of other kids there. So sometimes you have to be more subtle, or a little more careful, or you may choose things more differently. The plan should also fit in with the routines of the setting. If you're developing a reinforcement plan, for instance, and the class is structured so that instructional activities change about every 45 or 30 minutes, you would want to set up the reinforcement program so that it fits in with that schedule. In other words, what's the natural routine of the setting, and how can you make your intervention fit in with that? The more closely it aligns with the setting, the more likely it is to be implemented. Also, interventions shouldn't be something that's going to cost a lot of money or take a lot of time or resources. The fact is, if they do, they're not going to be maintained over time. Fortunately, a lot of really good interventions and effective interventions don't cost a lot of extra money. You also have to consider whether or not your intervention is going to have an immediate impact on the student's behavior. Often when we develop interventions, we know that it's going to take a long time, for instance, for the student to learn new skills. But we need to consider things we can do right away that might have an impact on the student's behavior. That's why antecedent strategies are really important. The advantage of antecedent kinds of strategies, things like changing instruction, changing the way things are organized, if you can identify some good strategies, they tend to work very quickly because they're not requiring the student to learn anything. Using or teaching alternative behaviors or new skills for a student, things like social skills, those are things that can have a long-term effect, but they take a long time to actually work. So we need to think about things we can do that's going to help the situation right away and allow folks to work on more long-term things. Sometimes you have to make compromises also. Sometimes there might be an ideal intervention, but you know that it would be too labor intensive to be carried out on a long-term basis. So you have to do some brainstorming and look at what are some acceptable alternatives for interventions. Again, that's why it's important to have people who are actually going to be carrying out the plan involved in the planning process. What are things that those individuals are willing and able to do over the course of maybe a couple of months? The competing behavior model is just a way of diagramming the planning process for developing a behavior support plan. And I found over the years that when teams use this model, they're able to develop interventions that are more on target. So it's something that I still do, and I highly recommend it to people who are developing behavior support plans. It's been around for a number of years. It was developed by Rob O'Neill, who's a professor in special education at the University of Oregon. And some of his colleagues developed it, and they've been using it ever since, and it's been adopted by people all over the world. The advantage is it lets you see right away, or it's a visual description or a visual diagram to show you what's the reinforcer for the problem behavior and what alternative behaviors do you need to teach, and what is it you want the student to actually be doing. So what's the desired behavior? And it's a way of looking at the level of reinforcement that's associated with each of those behaviors. And sometimes it's a good way just to show people why problem behaviors are occurring. You look at the behavior that you want to see the student doing, and you write in the amount of reinforcement the student gets, which sometimes isn't real high, and then you write in the problem behavior and the amount of reinforcement associated with the problem behavior, and you can see that compared to the problem behavior, the desired behavior doesn't get as much reinforcement. So here's an example of just basically what we're looking at. The top panel in the diagram here is showing you what's happening currently. So you've got a problem behavior occurring, and it occurs in the context of some environmental cues. And there's some reinforcer that's maintaining this problem behavior. What you actually want to see is you want the student to engage in some appropriate behavior to access the same reinforcer. So the key to effective behavior intervention planning is you understand what the student's after, and you teach the student a different way of getting it. So whenever these cues come up, whenever the situation comes up, the student will engage in the new behavior instead of the problem behavior. It's just a little Robert Frost quote to make a point. So, with the competing behavior model, here's the basic diagram. Sometimes we have a setting event that we add as well, as you saw in some of the summary statements. And sometimes you don't have a setting event. Sometimes you just have the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Here's the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. Now we're going to add the desired behavior. The desired behavior is whatever you want the student to be doing in this situation. So let's say that the independent work is the antecedent. The problem behavior is the student makes negative remarks to peers and destroys materials in order to escape the task. That's the summary statement that goes here in the middle. What is it you actually want the student to be doing during independent work? Well, you want the student to be working. Then you look at the consequences. What are the reinforcers that are currently available to the student when he or she is actually working? And maybe the consequences, well, the student will get a good grade on the assignment. Then you look at the problem behavior. The consequence for the problem behavior is the student immediately escapes. And you can see for some students, this is a competing set of behaviors. That's why it's called a competing behavior model. You can see that the problem behavior gets immediate, powerful reinforcement. It's negative reinforcement in this case. The desired behavior gets pretty delayed and minimal reinforcement. So when you look at it this way, sometimes it's really obvious that this is why the student is engaging in the problem behavior. We also want to consider an alternative behavior. Sometimes the alternative behavior is a new skill that we're teaching the student to come to the same outcome as a problem behavior. So we might consider teaching the student to ask for a brief break. That would lead to a really short escape and the student would come back. Or sometimes we might decide that it's better to teach the student to ask for some kind of help or assistance. That really doesn't result in escaping the task, but it might help with the difficulty of the situation, so the student can escape the aversive, difficult task. So teaching a student to ask for a break or teaching the student to ask for help might be alternative behaviors. In our behavior support plan, we want to address all of those things. So what we want to do is we want to build a list of potential things that we might do to teach new behaviors and make those happen more. Then we want to bring together different people and talk about things we can do to make the problem behavior be reinforced less. So this is the end of the first segment. We'll cover the rest of the lecture in the next part.